Indeed. Mark, thanks so much for having me along today. It's really nice to meet some people who I've sort of corresponded with before, whose work I've admired from afar, and I think some new and less familiar names as well. So hopefully we will also be in touch in the future. So for those of you I haven't yet met, I'm Katie Kenny. I'm one of the Deputy Directors at the Sydney Centre for Healthy Societies at the University of Sydney, where we have quite a long-standing program around the social science of AMR, much like Mark's, your AMR Scapes or the Centre to Impact AMR that's also doing such wonderful work in this space. But before I get into it, I was also going to acknowledge that I'm fortunate to usually live and work on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. Today, I'm zooming in from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagera people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So today, I'm going to talk about how AMR and how AMS strategies to combat it are known and governed within the hospital setting, or to put it differently, the deployment of what I'm calling the antimicrobial gaze here. And while this obviously has sort of local relevance for hospital systems, I think it also speaks to those sort of more global processes where data itself has become a really central element in global approaches to combat AMR. So it's a real treat to sort of speak to an audience that needs no convincing of the importance of AMR. So as I'm sure you already know, AMR refers to the ability of microbes to resist the drugs that once killed them, and is driven in large part, though not exclusively, by the overprescription of overly broad spectrum antibiotics. So prescribing practices, or in other contexts, consumption patterns, have become a key sort of point of data generation and also a point of intervention in strategies to counter AMR. So in recent years, these antimicrobial stewardship programs have been rolled out to sort of optimize the use of antibiotics by using the narrowest spectrum drugs for the shortest period of time, only when really necessary. And within these AMS programs, surveillance and auditing of prescribing practices have become really the key mechanism of action, if you like, the primary form of monitoring. So you can see this in national AMR strategies like we have in Australia, in global initiatives like the WHO GLASS platform that aims to standardize surveillance and reporting across contexts worldwide. And so prescribing becomes, I guess, a proxy measure because of the centrality of overprescribing and the driving of resistance, and because of the sort of ease of monitoring prescribing patterns. It's easier to monitor that than to sort of roll out extensive sensitivity testing sort of hospital sector wide. So prescribing behavior becomes this sort of stand-in measure for how well AMR is being addressed, at least in the hospital setting. So what this looks like, of course, varies across contexts, but in general terms and in contexts like Australia and sort of other OECD countries, this is often accomplished by the ongoing surveillance of prescribing practices that are sort of watched through electronic medical records, alongside episodic, sort of discrete auditing that provides a snapshot of concordance on any given day or at any given moment. So it's this ongoing surveillance plus episodic auditing that I'm sort of referencing when I'm talking about monitoring in more general terms. And so today I'm going to talk through what knowing and seeing AMR and AMS in this way makes visible, and what might be obscured, and how this whole system might end up sort of delimiting what interventions are seen as possible in forestalling the sort of global advance of antimicrobial resistance. So to help conceptualize the role of monitoring in AMR and AMS, we turned to some sort of familiar friends in the social science literature on surveillance auditing and classification. So here I'm thinking about work by people like Michel Foucault, Nicholas Rose, Michael Power, Marilyn Strathern, Jeff Bowker, and Susan Lee Starr. And collectively, these scholars and others, of course, provide a kind of wealth of concepts to work with and make sense of what we were seeing in this research. So prime among them was Foucault's analysis of the panopticon as illustrative of modern governmental techniques. So if you have not encountered it before, the panopticon was a sort of a carceral technology of a centralized watchtower surrounded by cells. And the idea would be that the sort of threat or the prospect of being watched would induce prisoners to sort of self-police. And this becomes a metaphor for disciplinary technologies or disciplinary techniques of governance, the way that certain technologies or modes of governing can be deployed in order to bring about particular desired or prescribed forms of behavior and sort of induce them to be routinely enacted as norms. So in AMS, sort of by virtue of prescribing practices being monitored through electronic medical records, through the continuous surveillance and episodic auditing, the hope is that prescribers will sort of self-police and be more judicious in the ways that they prescribe antibiotics. But it's not just surveillance here that sort of, or surveillance itself that needs to be interrogated. As Bowker and colleagues sort of also explain, the decision of what precisely to survey, this is inherently also a political act because of the fact that it reduces the multiplicity of potential ontologies into a singular reality. So surveillance inevitably, to some degree, flattens the texture of social life into often quite binary outcome measures. So in the case of antimicrobial resistance, whether particular prescriptions are technically concordant with the best practice therapeutic guidelines, sort of that judgment relies on just that professional judgment. And as those of us with a sort of even passing interest in STS will already know, there's always interpretive work required to bridge that gap between abstracted, decontextualized guidelines and everyday local practices. So sort of from the start, the surveillance and auditing that AMS programs rely on necessarily flatten complex clinical practices with quite high degrees of interpretive flexibility into the sort of binary outcome measure of success or failure at guideline concordance. I'm failing to make this advance. There we are. So I'm going to be talking here about a particular study or a particular analysis that's part of a longer program of work in the social science of AMR, much of it funded by the ARC and variously involving hospital ethnography, video recorded meetings, interviews, focus groups that have sort of been carried out between 2014 and now. But this particular analysis draws on a linkage project, and more specifically 42 interviews that were carried out between 2018 and 2022 with sort of everyone ranging from ward nurses and practicing clinicians up to hospital managers and executives. And the interviews focused on the sort of day-to-day practices of governance in and across hospitals. And surveillance and auditing, even more monitoring more generally, weren't really on our radar as key sites of interest, but they sort of came up almost immediately in fieldwork, prompting the analysis here. So quite quickly, it became obvious that while hospital governance might help short-term institutionalized imperatives, it may not meaningfully advance the sort of broader, longer-term AMR agenda. Also, that normative questions of the form, what should be done, often became displaced by the seemingly more objective or technical questions of what can be or what is being done. And that monitoring AMR and AMS in this way could actually sideline the bigger picture issues that are at stake in AMR. So The first of these ways in which surveillance data was used in sort of quite a carceral way to police clinical behaviour was to deliver what the organisation wants. So brace yourself, there is some spicy language in these data excerpts. I apologise in advance. So this first excerpt was from an interview with a very high-level hospital executive who quite candidly told us this, or it's something you can police. Don't waste your time trying to win their hearts and minds, just make them do it. If you can audit, if you can monitor, just get them to do it. And if they don't do it, thump them. So that's the culture of, yeah, I'll do what I'm told. And also that this is what the organization wants. So here you can kind of see the deployment of monitoring and auditing in like very disciplinary ways, which also speak to the sort of fear dynamic that you see in this next excerpt. So this was a clinician manager. And I think this really nicely illustrates the way that doing the right thing by your patients is obvious, but there are also these other dynamics having to do with fear, drawing attention, raising red flags, or being humiliated that sort of loom as a result of deviating from what the hospital deems to be best practice. So here, electronic surveillance and auditing was seen as a way of delivering on what the organisation wants through the mobilisation of threat and fear and wanting to avoid red flags in your audit. But there was another way of delivering what the organisation wants through a sort of elaborate choreography of compliant data. Sorry, I'm struggling to advance these slides. There we are. So asked about the process of producing the required surveillance data and prescribing practices, this ID clinician told us that, you know, when you get the surveillance data, it's more about the cleanup of the approvals that haven't been done. So within the electronics approval system, prescriptions that weren't approved or didn't align with national guidelines were flagged and had to be followed up by the ID clinicians, like this one who were tasked with cleaning up those sort of approvals. So in practice, this cleaning up became an end in and of itself, which was seen as suboptimal, but also better than the alternative, which would be to be going out and sort of being in everyone's business about their prescriptions out on rounds. So as this clinician went on to say, do I really want to go sort of out into the wards and do a round of every patient's antibiotics? No, I do not. So the idea behind the system and the algorithms in place were sort of seen as a good idea, but thinking about, like, does this actually happen in practice? This participant said, I don't know. I actually don't know. So in this way, the sort of compliance was constructed through the production of auditable compliance data, not necessarily compliant practice. So overall, the sort of electronic approvals process was viewed as positive in intent, and especially in terms of this kind of algorithmic support of best practice prescribing. But in practice, the surveillance data became sort of an object of intervention itself, displacing the focus on practice change from the actual behaviour of prescribing to its digital representation of approvals for approvals in the surveillance data. And as a result, the sort of construction of compliant data and the avoidance of those red flags that we heard about earlier sort of became an end in itself. So this notion of sort of compliant data, I think, illustrates the very limited purview of what I'm calling the antimicrobial gaze, and the shortcomings of knowing everyday clinical practice in this sort of auditable, datafied form. And another critical issue in the interviews was the need to work with this compliant data to produce a legible account of improvement or success according to predetermined metrics. But there was still very little scope for sort of engagement with the question of what constitutes success in the first place. So that brings us to this second theme of how success was defined and made. What is a successful level of guideline concordance? And this sort of turned out to be open to quite different interpretations. So in this first excerpt, a clinician says, guidelines are just guidelines. They're just a rough guide. So they were more interested in clinically what was appropriate than the approval being done properly. And the second clinician says, sort of reflects on the fact that they're not sure that there was ever sort of any evidence for what the starting point was, but in order to change anything, you need to sort of produce new data when sort of the original practices didn't have much data behind them in the first place. So we can see that sort of articulation of that classic STS point about interpretive flexibility, that guidelines are just guidelines, and that the sort of evidence base underpinning current practices might not always be as unequivocal or even particularly rigorous as we think. So similarly, whether a particular level of guideline concordance was a success or failure was also open to considerable interpretation. So this first executive was really quite hardlined and had little patience for incremental improvement, while the second was sort of more interested in framing things positively in an attempt at continual improvement. So the first executive says, we have meetings where we say 80% concordance, like it's a good thing. I mean, 1 in 5 people did not get the proper antibiotic. We all patted ourselves on the back as if this is fantastic. And he's saying, what? I don't think so. How is that okay? We have this sort of, you're getting close, you're getting 70 to 80%, it's okay. And we have parties if we go from 40 to 50%. I go, what? Like, yeah, no. Whereas this second executive says, 85% of the data is positive and what we did right, and these are the things we need to improve on. And that's how he sort of likes to mobilize this accreditation process that generates a lot of compliance sort of feedback about sort of harnessing the positive, emphasizing the good, and assess how you're tracking in a positive way. So I think the contrast between these two excerpts really illustrates the tension between different visions of success and how audits can become so decontextualized that their numerical outcomes can be utilized sort of in whatever direction one wishes. So in that sense, they become a mechanism of performing accountability rather than being held accountable. So a third and related theme was on the strategic uses of data for the purpose of governance objectives, in particular, this hospital accreditation process I just discussed. So the sort of way that hospitals become accredited has changed actually over the last few years. And while we were starting this research, it was on a sort of every 3-yearly basis where the auditors would come to the hospital, check sort of performance against a broad range of standards across all sorts of areas, and failure to meet those standards could compromise the hospital's accreditation and ability to continue operating. So there was a lot of cynicism about the ability of accreditation to improve practice because it was only episodic, and because of the decontextualized and depersonalized datification of complex and nuanced practices. So this first executive said, what accreditation is meant to achieve is that facilities are providing best practice, best evidence-based practice according to national standards. What actually happens is that when we come up for survey every 3 years, facilities set to and get everything in place and update policies and collect data in preparation for the survey. So what doesn't happen, but should happen, is that we don't do it every 3 years. We just do it always. It is an ongoing cycle. And this second excerpt comes from a manager who told us that, the interpretation of accreditation is that it doesn't necessarily drive activity. It gets people engaged for a brief period of time for the purposes of passing accreditation, but then they'll just rack off again. So this divide between the complexities of practice and their datafied representation, these sort of tensions aren't confined to the AMS space. But what it does illustrate, I think, is that the sort of epistemic contestation at the heart of datification underlies a lot of these hospital governance processes more generally. And in these excerpts, accreditation processes were discussed as shaped by episodically engaged administrators and non-specialist assessors who would assess based on data that was produced for the purposes of successful accreditation, almost divorced from the purposes of improving practice in any meaningful way. So here, another executive details what they saw as preferable, an approach of naming and shaming. So this executive said, you know, they really ought to be sending us league tables, naming and perhaps even shaming us in comparison to our peers, because I think we're all allowed to operate in little bubbles. And they say they have little idea what antibiotics colleagues are using. That information doesn't flow. We have no data. And if sort of this manager professors sort of being kept in blissful ignorance and kept in a state of data ignorance, it's never brought to their attention. So I think one of the things that's really interesting here in this call for naming and shaming and prevention of data ignorance suggests sort of an internalization of an antimicrobial gaze in which data still reigns supreme. But even here, I think this quote speaks to the direction in which data does and doesn't travel. So it sort of illustrates the hierarchical asymmetry inherent to panoptic perspectives. The data flows up for the reasons of accountability and hospital governance systems, but it doesn't actually flow back down to inform practice in a meaningful way. So finally, what is the cost of seeing and knowing the problem of antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial stewardship activities in this way? What is the cost of the antimicrobial gaze? So this participant, like many inpatient-facing roles, sort of says that AMS was never really about the patient, and it was only ever about the prescribing of the drug, or I might even argue about the data about the prescribing of the drug. So they say AMS wasn't brought in about the patient, it was brought in about the antibiotic. My thought always is if antimicrobial stewardship was designed to be about the patient, then teams would be involved. But it's always been about the drug. It's always been about the prescribing of the drug. It's not been about the patient. That's how this participant sees it. I think WHO focused on the wrong end of the stick. I just think if it was patient-centered, then nurses, pharmacists, all of us would have been seen as part of the role right at the beginning, rather than trying to invest other professional groups in the process now. So collation of data centered on concordance with best practice guidelines. This what sort of, I guess, characterizes the antimicrobial gaze that I'm trying to articulate here, really risks eliding the patient altogether and becoming an end in itself. And in this sense, success might consist as much in the production of compliant data as it does in the reduction of rates of resistant infections or even deaths due to resistant organisms, which interestingly is not institutionally monitored. So this can shape daily practice and institutional governance in ways that satisfy short-term governance objectives while inadequately grappling with the sort of unwieldy and longer-term challenge of AMR. So to sort of return to some of the framing concepts by way of a conclusion, Powers explains that in many ways, the explosion of audits in contemporary society is sort of a pervasive institutional response to widespread and often unwieldy risk. But he also cautions that in becoming a mostly cosmetic practice, auditing can obscure more complex risks and can sort of inadvertently perpetuate a form of learned ignorance. And I think this resonates with the current auditing of AMR in the hospital setting, where the production of comforting data on compliance prescribing becomes the primary thing that the hospital seeks to see. So I guess my overall conclusion would be that without critically questioning what monitoring AMR in this way actually achieves, the continued deployment of the antimicrobial gaze through ever-increasing forms of surveillance and auditing risks watching the problem of rising rates of antimicrobial resistance without meaningfully acting to forestall its advance. So that brings me to the end of the slides I have prepared for today. I'm going to go ahead and